everyone, I thought I would start off the PowerPoint with a bit of a fun trailer, so I hope you enjoyed my introduction video to the cardiac conduction system. Please have your sound turned on for the remaining of the presentation as it's interactive. Let's get started. I've made a list here of what we're going to talk about in the presentation. We're going to start out with a brief review of cardiac anatomy, and then we're going to talk about what cardiac conduction actually is, followed by a list of cardiac conduction components, then cardiac conduction pathway, talk a little bit about pacemaker function and settings. We're going to get into more detail about the cardiac conduction components. Then I've included 3 videos, one on action potential, one on depolarization, both by the Khan Academy, and another one on how it all comes together. At the end of the slides, there's questions to be answered, and followed by a reference slide. Enjoy. I thought we would start out this presentation with a brief overview of the myocardium. I chose a nice clear black and white picture here just to refresh our memory from what we learned in our body system section of the medical terminology course. Primarily in the following slides, we are going to be focusing on the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of His, the right and left bundle branches, the Purkinje fibers. There will also be a few other components that will facilitate with conduction, and we will talk about those as we move along here in the presentation. So let's go to the next slide. So before we talk about the components of the cardiac conduction system, let's actually talk about what it is. The cardiac conduction system is a group of specialized cardiac muscle cells located in the wall of the heart that send signals to the heart muscle, causing it to contract. A neat thing about the cardiac conduction system is that it has its own built-in conduction system for coordinating contractions. The other thing to note is that all muscle fibers in each region are electrically linked together by intercalculated discs. This means that there are actually connections that electrically join muscle fibers into a single unit. This will cause both atrial walls to contract at the same time and both ventricular walls to contract at the same time. Another thing to note is that cardiac muscle rhythm is controlled by autonomic nerve signals. Let's move on to the next slide. The components of the cardiac conduction system include the sinoatrial node, also known as the SA node, Bachmann's bundle, internodal pathway, atrioventricular node, also known as the AV node, the bundle of His, the right bundle branch, the left bundle branch, including the left anterior fascicle and the left posterior fascicle, and the Purkinje fibers. 4 structures embedded in the wall of the heart specialize in generating those strong impulses and conducting them to certain regions of the heart wall. Those 4 structures are the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibers. Let's move along to the next slide. Before we get into more detail about the cardiac conduction components, let's talk a little bit about the cardiac conduction pathway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by drawing a heart. By no means is it to scale, or am I an artist, but what's important is that there's the 4 chambers. A normal heart's conduction will begin in the SA node, which is located in the right atria. When those pacemaker cells becomes charged, the SA node will fire, sending an impulse through the interatrial septum and across to what's called the Bachmann's bundle, which is right in here. Bachmann's bundle. It will also send impulses down the internodal pathways down to the AV node. Here's the AV node. The AV node will then become charged and will continue the impulses to the bundle of His, and it will branch off into the right and left bundle branches, essentially ending with the Purkinje fibers. So there we have a little bit about cardiac conduction pathway. Let's move on to the next slide. So as we have mentioned in the previous slides, there are specialized cells whose function is to create an electrical impulse and act as the heart's pacemaker. The main area that fills this important function is the SA node. The main pacemaker paces at a rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. So this is our main pacer, the SA node. Now The pacemaker function dictates the rate at which the heart will cycle through its pumping action. Each cell cluster has an intrinsic rate, which we see here, the SA node, the atrial cells, the AV node, all the way down to the Purkinje cells. The intrinsic rate of each type of cell is slower than the cells that precede it. You'll see the heartbeats are slower as we go down. If the faster pacer doesn't fire for some reason, which could be the SA node, or the AV node, or the bundle of His, the next fastest will be there as a backup to ensure function that is as close to normal as possible. So if we see that the SA node is failing, our next rate could be the atrial cells, 55 to 60 beats per minute, or the AV node will be picking up the slack for the SA node, and we'll be looking at 45 to 50 beats per minute. This is where we'll see some changes as well on our ECGs, and we'll learn about that in some other presentations. If the AV node fails, now we're looking to the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje cells, and those are quite lower heart rates, as you can see at the Purkinje cells with 20 to 40 beats per minute. So that is our pacemaker functions and settings, and let's move on. The sinoatrial node is the heart's main pacemaker. It's a cluster of specialized cells. It responds to the needs from the body on information it receives from the nervous, circulatory, and endocrine systems. It's located in the wall of the right atrium. 59% of its blood supply mainly comes from the right coronary artery. 38% is the other blood supply that comes from the left coronary artery. And 3% it arises from both. The intrinsic rate is between 60 and 100 beats per minute, and it triggers a sequence of electrical events in the heart. Let's go to the next slide. The Bachmann's bundle is an internodal pathway connecting the two atrias. It rapidly transmits the impulse through the atria, causing synchronized innervation of the atrial myocardial cells. Here we have the Bachmann's bundle right here. Let's move on to the next slide. There are three internodal pathways. Anterior pathway located right here, the middle, and the posterior pathway. The main purpose is to transmit the impulse from the SA node to the AV node. The pathway is found in the walls of the right atrium. Let's move to the next slide. The atrioventricular node is the second pacemaker of the heart. It is located in the wall of the right atrium next to the coronary sinus and the septal leaflet of the tricuspid valve. It's responsible for slowing down conduction from the atria to the ventricles. It gets its blood supply only from the right coronary artery, and its intrinsic rate is between 45 and 50 beats per minute. Let's move on to the next slide. The bundle of His starts at the AV node and eventually gives rise to the bundle branches. It's found partially in the walls of the right atrium and in the interventricular septum. This is the only route of communication between the atria and the ventricles. Its intrinsic rate is between 40 and 45 beats per minute. Let's move on to the next slide. The right bundle branch starts at the bundle of His. It causes stimulation in the fibers that will innervate the right ventricle and right face of the interventricular septum, and it terminates in the Purkinje fibers. Let's go to the next slide. The left bundle branch begins at the end of the bundle of His. It travels through the interventricular septum, and it causes stimulation in the fibers that will innervate the left ventricle and the left face of the interventricular septum. It ends at the beginning of the left anterior fascicle and the left posterior fascicle. Let's go talk about those fascicles in the next slide. Now I'm going to use this picture again that we used in previous slides, and we're going to talk about the left anterior fascicle and the left posterior fascicle. In the previous slides, when we were drawing the heart, we actually drew the left and right bundle branches as they went all the way through the left and right ventricles to the Purkinje fibers. Now, I left out the left posterior fascicle and the left anterior fascicle because I just wanted to simplify the pathway of cardiac conduction. So right now, let's talk about the left anterior fascicle. It travels through the left ventricle to the Purkinje cells. It innervates the anterior and superior aspect of the left ventricle, and it's a single strand. Now the left posterior fascicle leads to the Purkinje cells and innervates the posterior and inferior aspects of the left ventricle. So we see the left bundle branch, and it actually has a beginning and an end. Then we're going to see the left posterior fascicle. This is where it is right here. And then this is where the left anterior fascicle starts. So the bundle branch doesn't travel all the way down. We just did that to simplify the cardiac conduction pathway. So the left bundle branch is only about here to here. And then the left anterior fascicle will complete that and then move on to the Purkinje cells. I hope this makes sense. Let's move on to the next slide. The Purkinje system is made up of individual cells just beneath the endocardium. They innervate the myocardial cells, and it initiates ventricular depolarization. Let's move on to the next slide. Now I have a couple videos to show you. They're both made by the Khan Academy, and the way that I'm uploading my PowerPoint into more of a video, they wouldn't let me actually run the videos from the Khan Academy. So they're excellent electrophysiology videos. They're necessary in truly understanding how cardiac conduction works. They'll make your brain hurt a little bit, but they'll help us along the way once we get into that in the course. I couldn't explain it any better, and that's why I'm forwarding you on to these videos. So if you want to pause the video and write down each link and then take a look at them when you have some time, they're really great videos, so I hope you enjoy. So here's the link to the video that explains action potential. If you don't want to write down this link, you can just go to www.khanacademy.org and you can actually just search action potential, and there'll be a few videos in there that you can take a look at. Mine specifically is the one that I've listed here. Now again, here's the link for the depolarization video. Again, you can go to www.khanacademy.org and check it out. This is a great video that shows sort of how everything in the heart comes together, the pumping action, the blood, and the cardiac conduction. So take a look at that. It's on YouTube. So here are my 3 questions. 1. If conduction was interrupted in the SA node, causing it to fail, what kinds of rhythms would we see on an ECG, and what would be their characteristics? Number 2, describe the phases of action potential and describe depolarization. You'll find these in the videos. And number 3, when we're talking about cardiomyocytes, what is sodium responsible for? You might find that in one of your textbooks.